scientific, engineering, and technological research can contribute to the industrial development seems perfectly cogent. Our 2017 conference will celebrate some of the work that we undertake with public and private sector partners to contribute to industrial development. Our expert speakers will share perspectives on challenges and opportunities for industrial development and related issues in several sectors. Topics covered include technology localization for industrial development, the development of small, medium, and micro enterprises in various sectors, infrastructure innovation as an industrial development enabler, emerging manufacturing technologies, a competitive aerospace sector, cybersecurity as a prerequisite for Industrial 4.0, and of course, sustainable economic growth through cleaner production and efficient resource utilization. So the conference exhibition will feature live demonstrations of CSIR developed technologies that are befitting, or rather benefiting an array of sectors, from mining and energy to aerospace and defense. And the conference program features many of our industry partners, collaborations that bode well for ensuring that the CSIR's innovation portfolio is aligned with the needs of the industry. And today, our CEO, Dr. Thulani Dlamini, looks forward to engaging with you on ways to strengthen the CSIR's role in industrial development and providing value-adding solutions to some of your pressing challenges. So I certainly hope that you have an enjoyable and a very fruitful conference. And before we begin, I kindly request that we all stand to our feet so that we can all sing our national anthem. And leading us in this will be the Soweto Opera Quadro. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. Our panel this morning consists of Minister Rob Davies, as well as Saul Levin, the Executive Director of Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, who will be talking to us about industrial policy. Where does innovation fit in? We also have Jorge Maia, who is the Head of Research and Information, Industrial Development Corporation, and he'll be speaking on trends in and outlook for the global and South African economies. We also have here Sizwe Nxasana, founder of Future Nation Schools and chairperson of National Student Financial Aid Scheme and the National Education Collaboration Trust. He'll be talking on skills and innovation as a driver for industrial development in South Africa. And we also have Dr. Philip Goyns, the CSIR board member, to give concluding remarks. But first up, to welcome us, a round of applause for Dr. Thulani Dlamini, the CEO of the CSIR. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you all to kindly keep your phones on silent, and please do also remember to keep the conversations going on social media at CSIR on Twitter, at CSIR South Africa on Facebook and Instagram. Remember to hashtag CSIRConf 2017. That's CSIRCONF 2017. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Minister of Trade and Industry, Honorable Dr. Rob Davies. Our guest speakers this morning, Mr. Sizwe Nxasana, Mr. Saul Levin, Mr. Jorge Maia, and Dr. Philip Goyns. CSR board members present today, members of the CSR executive, our conference speakers representing public sector, private sector, and higher education sector, both locally and international, members of the media, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A very hearty welcome to all of you to the 6th CSIR Conference 2017. Over the years, the CSIR Conference has become a flagship event in the CSIR calendar, and rightly so. The conference has proven to be an effective platform for the CSIR to engage in dialogue with our stakeholders, where we share the work of the CSIR with you. But more importantly, we will also listen to your insights and perspectives that inform and guide our innovation agenda. We look forward to robust engagements during the course of the next 2 days, and I'd like to thank all the speakers who have accepted our invitation to be part of this very important event. Over the next 2 days, we expect over 1,500 participants in the conference. We'll have over 26 parallel sessions. We have 21 panel discussions, exhibitions, and various tours to CSIR facilities. The theme for this conference this year is Ideas That Work for Industrial Development. And the focus of industrial development is rooted on our mandate, which requires us as the CSIR to perform research and technological innovation which fosters both scientific and industrial development. Over the past years, the CSIR has made significant progress in terms of strengthening our scientific capabilities. However, as we look into the future, we realize that we ought to place an equal emphasis in terms of our role with regards to industrial development in South Africa. If we are to live up to the expectation of our mandate, which is to contribute towards improving the quality of lives of the people of South Africa, which can be translated into us contributing towards addressing the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. We can only achieve this if we work very closely with our partners from the public sector and the private sector to ensure that our innovations are indeed directed by the needs of our stakeholders. There should never be any doubt about the catalytic role of innovation in driving industrial development and economic growth. The world that we live in today is dynamic, competitive, and complex. And we are seeing an unprecedented, accelerated pace of technological change, driven primarily by the convergence of technologies. Indeed, the fourth industrial revolution has arrived. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether South Africa is ready for the disruptions and the shifts that will be brought about by this revolution. And how do we ensure that this revolution benefits all sectors of society, especially the marginalized and the poor? It is my wish that our discussions over the next 2 days will start to provide answers to some of these questions. Once more, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you to the 6th CSIR Biannual Conference. I hope that the networks that we will create during this conference will lead to new innovation opportunities that will contribute towards industrial development of South Africa. Welcome once more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dlamini. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a privilege, really, to be at the forefront of a solutions-driven community such as this. And our next speaker is, of course, the Honorable Minister, who is here to give a keynote address. I'd like us all to give him a warm round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Dr. Thulani Dlamini, Chief Executive Officer of the CSIR, fellow panelists who are sitting here on the stage, Saul Levin, Jorge Maia from the Industrial Development Corporation, Sizwe Nxasana, who's now a guru on skills development, and Dr. Goyns from the CSIR board. Let me greet all of you. Let me also greet some of the senior state officials who are here. In particular, I want to draw attention to our Deputy Director General in the Department of Trade and Industry for Industrial Development, Garth Strachan, who is our main driver of industrial policy, and also probably our chief interlocutor with the CSIR. Let me also greet everyone else who's present here at this important event. Let me start off by congratulating the CSIR, what I heard just now, your 72nd birthday, and say that it is indeed a pleasure to come and hear that somebody has a birthday which is counting up more years than my own. So it's a real privilege to be able to keep you here for that, but also more importantly, that the CSIR is an institution which is a very, very important institution in the South African government and also to contribute to our economic development. So I want to thank you for inviting me here as the Department of Trade and Industry. The theme that you've chosen, I think, for this conference is extremely important about technology and industrial development. So the issues I want to address is to start off by saying that I think, as a number of speakers have already indicated, we are entering an era, and are probably already in it, in which I think the premium for innovation has been significantly raised. Innovation has become more important than it ever was, not that it ever was unimportant, but it's becoming more and more important as we move further forward. I think that there are probably at least 3 domains of innovation, all of which are important, but not all of which I think are going to be the main focus of this conference. The first one, I think, is something which we have been trying to encourage and support, which is the innovation that arises from continuous improvement in industries, the so-called Kaizen method, which draws on inputs coming from the workforce, from the staff, and makes small improvements in technologies and in the applications of technologies. But over time, when you start looking back, you see that there's actually been a massive change and a massive improvement. That is an attitude of mind that I think we need to engender across our economy. The second one, of course, is that I think we have adaptations to local conditions of technologies whose probably core base has been developed elsewhere. Applications of technologies to local conditions. And of course, I think the application or app industry is probably one of the fastest growing and most important. And then the third one is actual greenfields inventions that would be inventions coming from laboratories or research centers. In all of those cases, and particularly the second two, the obvious and most important issue is ensuring the commercialization, the application of those innovations in industrial development. I think that's the fundamental and critical issue which we need to address. We all know, I think, of far too many examples where there have been inventions in South Africa, but we have not been able to take these up in commercial production, and that has resulted in the technology going offshore, and sometimes we end up importing the products of that technology that are made elsewhere rather than our own country. So that's the fundamental, I think, and critical challenge. Now, I think that what this says to us is, and I'm going to make a few more references to this fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0, although I have become aware that this is a little bit of a Eurocentric term. In China, they call this the new industrial revolution. I think they want to say there were a few in China before the first industrial revolution in Britain. So whatever you want to call it, I will make a few remarks about that, but I think that that is just adding to the imperative that I've already described. And I think that what this means is that we need to strengthen the relationship between our department in government, but with the industrial and the business sector, and the work that goes on in the Department of Science and Technology and in the CSIR, so that we can better understand the full gamut of research and development, science and technology, industrial research that's been undertaken here, and that we can work more effectively and efficiently to translate at least some of that into commercial opportunities that are going to support industrial development in our country. So this stage is one which, as I said already, I think we've missed a few tricks on it, probably one of the most important and challenging ones. But it's really, I think, that Professor Mushtaq Khan, who's a leading scholar on industrialization, he has referred to what he calls the learning effort that is required over the first 6 months of the commercialization of a new technology, when companies have to acquire the difficult knowledge and change and disrupt their systems to introduce the new technologies and implement this in production. And I think this is the time where I think and the stage in the development where we haven't been as agile and as effective as we need to be. And so I hope that a conference like this can develop some ideas. We have, of course, I think, got a base of collaboration already. And I'm going to refer to some of the examples of collaboration between our department and the efforts to industrialize the country more generally, and the work which has been going on in the CSIR and in the Department of Science and Technology. I want to refer to some of those examples because I think they do provide us with a platform to build on. So the first is that we have something called the National Cleaner Production Center, which has undertaken a significant amount of groundbreaking work to support domestic companies, industrial companies, to achieve better energy efficiency and carbon mitigation. And I think that this is an area where I think that a lot of research, even as I was walking around the exhibition, I think there's a lot of research that's going on in this. And I think it's going to be very important that we send a clear message to our companies as we do, that actually being able to demonstrate a greater carbon neutrality, a greater environmental responsibility is going to become increasingly an element of competitiveness. We will continue to act against what we think are unfair technical barriers to trade using environmental considerations where we think these are unfair. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that we need to own much more the transformation of all our industries, all our sectors, to a lower carbon economy. And that means that we are going to have to adopt new approaches, new technologies. Probably the leaders in the South African economy right now are a number of multinational companies that have come in and invested. But I think that we need to generate that knowledge much more across our value chains. It's also, I think, linked to this more effective waste management. And I think a number of the projects I saw in the exhibition are addressing that matter. The circular economy is becoming recognized as not only something which is important to defend the environment and protect our people from environmental degradation, but is also a source of potential jobs, and the reuse of materials can contribute to the solution of a number of developmental challenges in a cost-effective way. And so the National Cleaner Production Center, I think, is one example where we need to accelerate our efforts, as well as in the context of the Operation Pakisa on the waste economy and the circular economy, which is at the moment underway. Secondly, there is the work of the Technology Localization Implementation Unit, which is a unit which is existing to try to leverage the public procurement process to support domestic homegrown technologies being more widely used. Now, in the localization process generally, I think we are aware that while we have been using this policy tool and have used it to good effect in a number of cases, there are still a number of implementation challenges and a number of slippages in terms of the implementation of that. That is applied to localization generally, and I think the more slippages we have in localization generally, the more slippages we also have in the localization of technologies. And so I think I want to convey that there is a piece of work which is ongoing by our department, but also in collaboration with a number of other government departments, where we are aiming to improve and increase the enforcement of localization across government. Where we take a decision that we will use local goods, local manufacturing, and local technologies, that becomes no longer an option for some procurement officer at some public entity to decide whether to do or not. It's no longer an option, it's actually a directive. And I think we need to make sure that that is implemented more effectively. Then we also have the recently established National Industrialization Support Initiative, which has used an offset from the National Industrial Participation Program, the so-called offset arrangement, and this has been used to establish a facility which will provide South African companies with a product life cycle management platform, with a wide variety of support in interventions, including technology advancement, productivity improvement systems, engineering, digital manufacturing, tooling, design, and many others. And I wish to express our gratitude to the CSIR managers who have worked with the DTI to put this facility in place. And we look forward to witnessing the results of this project and the impact of its work in supporting domestic companies. Another important initiative which has arisen from the Mining Phakisa has been the Mining Technology Manufacturing and Sustainable Development Hub, which is what's called the Mining Hub. I already made reference to in the public sector where we take a decision that we will buy from local manufactured sources. We are able to do that under WTO rules because we are not signatories of the Plurilateral Protocol on Transparency in Government Procurement. We have not signed that because we know if we did, we would be disabling that particular tool. But we're not able to apply that in the private sector, so we need to use other tools in the private sector. And one of those was to say that the mining technologies that need to support the next phase of mining development in South Africa, we want to make sure that those are actually South African technologies. And the CSIR is working with us and is hosting this mining hub. Which is an incredibly important initiative because we want to make sure that the technologies that are required for deeper level mining, for more difficult technological mining are actually developed and are South African-based technologies so that we, in fact, support South African industries in this way. And I think all of these initiatives and some of the other collaborative work that we have been engaged in they demonstrate what we can do and what we must do. But I think that my overall message is that we need to accelerate these efforts. We need to increase the scale, and we need to increase the output, and in particular, we need to address the 6 months learning phase that I referred to earlier, quoting from Professor Mustak Khan. What I want to just conclude with is a few observations about this new phase that we're entering into, this new industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it. I happen to sit on the World Economic Forum's a group that is looking at these issues, and this is my exposure every year to these technological developments associated therewith. I think we all know what they are. You probably know better than I do what the technologies are. Robotization, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, where the CSIR is quite active in that area, big data, blockchain technologies, all of these things. In fact, the World Economic Forum talks about there being 60 or so technologies and business systems. And the point that they make is they say that they will be introducing not just incremental, but actually disruptive change in production, but not just in production, but also in all parts of our economic endeavors. And I think that the first point I want to make is that as these technologies come in and as these disruptions take place, we should not kid ourselves that this is now creating something called a post-industrial world or anything like that. I think that there was such a view around in some parts of the developed world a few years ago, and all of those countries that embraced that some years ago are now returning to understand the centrality and the importance of industrialization. But I think the other point is that a link to that is that if we think that there is a safe haven from this disruptive technological introduction in services or something, I think we better quickly understand that that is not the case. We have, for example, the introduction of electronic commerce, which will have a major impact on retail sectors. I think already we've seen that retail sectors in South Africa are beginning to transform and adopt electronic commerce. But in fact, I was recently in China, and I asked the Minister of Industry in China what percentage of retail transactions pass through electronic commerce in China, and he told me 30%. I understand that the corresponding figure in South Africa is 2%. So there's going to be some major changes there. They will have major disruptive effects on, for example, people sitting behind counters in retail shops. There will be jobs created perhaps in logistics, but probably more skilled jobs than people who are sitting behind tills in retail shops. Also, many other service sectors. The legal fraternity will see many of their records digitized in big data systems. Already you look at high-profile court cases and look at the lawyers. They've got their iPads there. And what are they doing? They say to the judge, I refer you to the case of this and this and this. And what they've done is they put in a few keywords and up comes all the references. That's what's happening. So the legal clerks are not going to be doing the kind of research that they used to do before. In the health sector and across, I think, our economies. Even in primary sectors, take agriculture, take something like the humble production and export of oranges. If you want to do that, you will have to show increasingly that no harmful pesticides are being used, that the fruit is free of this or that disease, that it's traceable back to this and this and this farm, and all of that requires that we actually have a sophisticated services sector linked to that production and export. And in fact, the agriculture sector is a sector where there is an anti-intuitive case where, in fact, the highest value you get is the production of fresh products using these technologies rather than processed products like, fresh fruit receives a much higher price than canned fruit, for example. So I think those are all sorts of things that are implying that these technological changes are happening. So I think that we need as a country to prepare ourselves. We need to prepare ourselves for a future in which this disruptive change is happening whether we like it or not, and we better get ready for it whether we like it or not, and where we can see that it can bring us advantages, but it can also bring many, many social challenges. I think some of the advantages, if I can just express my own sort of personal observation, is I think it might be easier for small enterprises to use some of these technologies, and the sunken capital that's required for some of these processes is probably less. There are opportunities for small businesses. We see examples, maybe more in other countries in Africa than in our own, of the use of new technologies, of various forms of robotics, even things like drones to solve all kinds of developmental challenges. We see the application of these technologies, and probably by small companies, not necessarily large companies with large sunken capital. And that's probably a plus. But on the other side, when I walk around even factories in South Africa, as I often do, I will hear managers tell me that they have taken the human error out of quality control. And what do they mean by that? They mean that they used to have a group of workers sitting down and weeding out the rejects. Now they've got a machine that does it instead. And many of the workers, well, just to put it anecdotally, I think are probably more likely to wear a white coat and press a button than to wear a red overall and do heavy lifting. So the working class is changing. Even those who want to represent the working class perhaps need to change their uniforms a bit. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. And I think that the good news is that I see young South Africans, females as well as men, on these production lines, and the companies will tell us that they have a good experience in South Africa, that the South African company is winning this or that award in the company competitions or even internationally. That's the good news. The bad news is that all of those have got some kind of qualification, probably from a TVET college in engineering and or in ICT. Those are the challenges. So I think that we need to get ourselves ready for this. We need to get ourselves ready in the sense of what I was saying right at the beginning, of technologies which are developed elsewhere. The 3D printer, it was not invented in South Africa, but the application of the 3D printer through, I think it's called AeroSwift project that you've got here in the CSIR, that's the application, and that's where innovation comes in. We also have our own technologies that are leading to mineral beneficiation, like titanium powder that's been developed here. The work that's been done on the hydrogen fuel cells, because, you know, we are moving into an era where motor vehicles, a number of countries are starting to say they won't be having petrol-driven motor vehicles by 2040. I think so. I've heard that was the last one I heard. Now, whether that happens or not, certainly there is a drive towards the introduction of different kinds of motor vehicles. We will be taking account of that, I can just say, when we announce the successor program to the automotive production and development program. Let me say that what we've established in the DTI, and this is not the only place in government where this is happening, but we have established a chief directorate that's looking at the future of industrial production and technologies that we've established in the DTI. And this new chief directorate will be undertaking research work, including with the OECD Development Center, to understand better how a developing middle-income country like South Africa should prepare for the fourth industrial revolution. We need to ensure that this process does not lead to deindustrialization of South Africa. And I mention that just to give one other example. I saw earlier this year a report that said that Adidas had moved some of its production, at least from Asia, back to Germany because they said artificial intelligence and 3D printing was cheaper than low labor cost in Asia. Now, we've never tried to compete on that, low labor cost, but this thing called reshoring, taking production back to where consumers are and taking production back to the centers of innovation, is probably something that the literature is warning us of. And so I think that we need to get ourselves ready to try to counter that as a potentiality by making our companies more technologically savvy and also to try to ensure that our people are able to master these kinds of technologies. So allow me to then to just say that I think that the work we've done, the platforms we've created are great, but the challenges are even huger. And that the interaction between technology development, research and innovation, and application in industrial development is going to require that we work harder, smarter, and more collaboratively in the future. So I welcome very much this conference. You will excuse me if I have to leave after one or two of the presentations. I can't stay until the absolute end, but I look forward to hearing a report about what's been achieved in this conference, and I hope that this is a productive and useful engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. So Dr. Rob Davies is serving his second term, and some of you will remember that during his first term, he oversaw the development and implementation of 3-year rolling industrial policy action plans. And he also was steering South Africa's participation in very important trade relations. So we do appreciate your contribution to the conversation. So our next speaker, Saul Levin, is the Executive Director of Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, a not-for-profit economic research institute. Levin has previously worked as a Chief Director in the Economic Development Department with oversight over the development finance institutions, reporting to the EDD. And prior to that, he spent 2 years as a senior manager at Standard Bank, working as a business operations manager. And he previously worked as the Chief of Staff for the Minister of Water and Forestry, as well as the Minister of Minerals and Energy. He's also worked as an economist at the Department of Trade and Industry and spent several years working in small business development at Nsika Enterprise Promotion Agency, and he holds a master's degree in sociology and a BCom degree from WITS. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Saul Levin.
Morning, everyone. I'm just going to time myself because I can talk for hours. So when you run a research institute, you end up doing lots of lecturing and training. Okay, morning, Minister. Mr. Jorge Maia, Dr. Thulani Dlamini, Sizwe Nxasana, and fellow panelists. I'd also like to acknowledge Garth Strachan, who in addition to being the DDG is also chair of the TIPS board. And good morning to colleagues and ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so my topic today is industrial policy. Where does innovation fit in? And the starting point for our discussion is the importance of the industrial sector to achieve economic growth. And I think the Minister has touched on some of these issues, but I just want to go into some discussion on that. History has shown us that the most successful nations in terms of economic growth and development were those that supported and contributed to building the industrial base of their economy. Even today, those developed economies that are thriving have strong industrial sectors, and Germany stands out here as a prime example, but it's not the only one. And it's also no accident that the developing countries that have thrived over the past few decades, particularly in Asia, have been those that have focused on building their industrial base. What's important to recognize here is that just having some industry is not necessarily a precondition to development, and it's not sufficient to have rapid economic growth. Having entry-level technologies that manufacture basic products give countries an entry point, but that entry point does not ensure rapid economic growth or development. History is also littered with those countries that became offshore destinations for very cheap assembly, only to find that they lose their industrial base when the conditions change or cheaper production takes place elsewhere or better incentives come along. For example, our neighbors in Lesotho discovered this the hard way at the end of the multi-fiber agreement, and they lost a large portion of their clothing production to South Asia. They fortunately didn't lose all of it with the Goa, but it did hit them hard. And so the question then becomes, is what takes a country from entry-level assembly to having robust industrial capacity and stronger economic growth? And this is where we talk about the industrial policy, and the ministers touched on some of that and the opening remarks by Dr. Dlamini as well. And what we see is we want to move from attracting industrial policy, plays an important role in attracting basic industry in the first place with comprehensive incentive structures, support framework, trade policies, and a whole range of measures. And it supports the development of these key industries. It also provides the linkages across the economy and access to markets. So with industrial policy, we can see that there's a role to be played in moving from the entry-level industries through to more comprehensive and successful markets, successful opportunities. And that's where innovation plays a key role and where it fits in to some of this thinking. Industrial development and innovation are inextricably linked. You don't have successful industrialization without strong innovation, and it takes us to having world-class operations. There are, however, many steps in between and different types of technologies and industries that need to be catered for on this path of development. And we can't assume that we just have one type of industry that we're catering for here, and I'll touch on some of that typology now. Industrial policy increasingly can't be and is not a blunt instrument, and given the global conditions and international agreements, it requires us to take complex and sophisticated approach. The autocratic imposition of industrial policy measures, which might have taken place in the Asian economies 50 years ago, are not an option particularly for a robust democracy like ours. Industrial policy, therefore, requires that we look at the context of our economy, the political economy, the nature of our industry, and understanding of the markets and opportunities. And when it comes to innovation and technology, the nuance of implementing appropriate policies that fit our context and our industrial structure. These issues are recognized in the National Industrial Policy Framework and in the Industrial Policy Action Plan, and these are important documents to look at and engage with, because they also talk to how we get some of that alignment across the various parts of government. And what we also see is the role of this conference in bringing these aspects together. So the agenda, I think, of this conference is insightful and brings together many of these issues. And I'll touch on some of these issues in my input. Okay, so if we're looking at the context of our economy and the political economy, I'm not going to give a comprehensive outline of the state of our economy, and Jorge Maia, I think, has been tasked with that responsibility. But I want to just note a few key issues that stand out for me in the context of this discussion. The first one is that we are facing a protracted period of slow growth, and we now are regularly dipping into quarters of negative economic growth. The economy has been on a downward trajectory from 2011, and we also never really fully recovered from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Coinciding with the end of the commodity boom that took place at the end of that took place in 2011, we've seen our industry being impacted as well, and we've been also tracking the slow growth across the developing world, excluding China. So we are not the only ones in this boat, but we are certainly, and in the last few quarters, I think we are starting to slip behind some of our competitor nations. The decline in the rate of investment in the economy is the second point, and this is taking place by both private sector and state-owned enterprises. The rate of investment has declined from a high of 23.5% of GDP in 2008, before the financial crisis and the first electricity crisis, to below 20% in the last quarter. And my next point here is the declining contribution of manufacturing to the economy from approximately 20% 2 decades ago to approximately 13% today. Again, this tracks trends across peer economies, but is nonetheless, it poses hard questions on how to sustain development and to grow decent work. We also see that there are key sectors in our economy that have shown remarkable resilience, despite the global downturn and slow economic growth. Agro-processing, for example, has shown remarkable growth over the past decade and is now a key sector of the economy that is also starting to show strong export growth. Previously, it wasn't a strong export sector, servicing mainly the domestic market, but we can see how it's taken off in terms of also now getting into that space. What we also see is the relative small size of the small to medium size business sector. And recent data shows that in 2015 there were 670,000 small businesses, formal small businesses. This was down from over 700,000 in 2008. And data shows that these businesses have employed 4.3 million people. We have approximately 1.5 million informal businesses with little change over the past few years. Despite South Africa's high unemployment rate, we also have a very low rate of people in self-employment as a percentage of total employment, and we're actually an outlier on that. So we're not seeing unemployed people going into self-employment, we're seeing unemployed people being unemployed. What is clear is that our economy is not in great shape at present, and there are a number of structural barriers that inhibit small business development and self-employment. It's not just people are not going into these things. There's very real reasons why we see some of these blockages. We also recognize there's a need for an urgent stimulus. However, in the context of declining fiscal resources, these are not easy time for policymakers. The manufacturing sector does, however, represent a significant opportunity for stimulus measures. And in that context, we've noted some, in our recent work, the stellar performance of the IDC in financing industrial sector. However, when compared to their global peers, there's a strong case to be made for further resources going to them to significantly expand their lending, particularly for innovative industrial firms. Moving to the political economy, I think there's many issues that we're faced with, and the papers are full of them, so I'm not going to touch on them here. But the impact of these issues is on the level of confidence in the economy. And one of the contributing, this then has a contributing factor to the lower than desired investment rates. It's also, however, naive to think that it's just the political environment that impacts on slow growth. We should not downplay the impact of the commodity bust and also what's happening in our neighboring economies who've also been seriously impacted by the commodity bust. There's also the structural factors that hold us back, which require attention and do receive attention. There's one issue that I thought I should just quickly touch on briefly, and that's the youth. In '94, in our democracy, we saw great promise of opportunity and scope for the youth to do things that previous generations had been unable to do. Young people growing up under democracy have experienced freedom that no other generation in South Africa has ever had. Importantly, young people today have been growing up during a period of massive technological upheaval, and they've been exposed to technologies and devices that open up a world of information and access to knowledge like never before. In a survey that I reviewed a few years ago, there was a finding that almost all learners across school quintiles, so 1 to 5 quintile, and geographic areas, so rural and urban, had access to a cell phone, and 75% of them were using it to access the internet, so that they're not illiterate in terms of what's going on in the globe. And what we see is that these and other economic factors are driving significant changes in our country. And we're seeing greater migration from rural areas to the metros, particularly of young people who are entering the job market, so your working age population. It changes the type of work that they're looking for, are able to do, and their view on the world. Yet the political freedom, access to information, technology, and the possibilities of democracy have not yielded the employment opportunities and delivered on the expectations of the youth. This is a serious mismatch, and with an increasingly youthful population, is already having a disruptive impact. I don't need to remind everyone of the disruptive impact. And through the use of technology and innovation, we could actually have an opportunity here to address this mismatch and start to draw in young people into a different type of career or job, or provide new enterprise opportunities. One of the issues that I'd also like to flag in the context of this discussion, and it was touched on by the CSIR CEO, which is the high levels of inequality that persist in South Africa. We remain the most or second most unequal society in the world, and we need to continually look at how innovation can reduce our levels of inequality as well as poverty. Okay, so when we're coming to looking at industry and innovation, why is innovation such a critical feature of industrial policy? The first point here is around investment. Innovation stimulates investment in production. It requires firm capabilities continually to be enhanced and improved, and includes production techniques and engineering capacity which are critical. And it's often not cutting edge, as people who work in the space will recognize, but it's about diffusion of technologies so that firms are able to do small things on production line, fix processes, and also where they can also catch up in terms of what their competitors are doing and improvements to product design. The next point is around a key feature is collaboration between industry and government, and there's an important role here between government and public institutions to support the enhancement of productive capabilities of firms. And this is where the institution, the science councils like CSIR and other science councils like MinTech and the Agricultural Research Council play a key role, as well as the universities. But what's also equally important is for firms to invest in innovation as well as in their employees. We also see that there's a spillover effect from the research and from innovation, and what we need to try and look at is how do we get it right to link the public and private sector to collaborate on innovation of research so we can benefit from these spillover effects. An interesting example from someone who was lecturing us on what was taking place in Italy is the shift of high-tech plastic producers into medical devices, and how they've been able to drive a different type of industry, and you see those spillovers resulting from innovation and a different access of markets and opportunities that then emerges. And then moving up the value chain, which requires investment in innovation and being more productive by creating greater value, which then in turn contributes to better employment prospects. And I think this was touched on by the Minister, where we see the people who remain employed getting better jobs and definitely better paying jobs, but are required to be more productive and do things differently. I will touch on the labour issues a little bit towards the end of my input. Industrialization in developed countries has taken place as a result of the increasing value add. Innovation and strategic use of technology. So it's where we want to be, but we need to be careful on how we get there. Innovation and new technologies is highly risky and sometimes very expensive. South Africa's own experiences here are indicative. The PBMR, the dual electric vehicle, and others are case studies of where things do not work out in this space. However, there's huge scope for significant innovation in supporting existing industry with systematic and gradual innovations, not only in the technologies they use, but also in how production is organized. And that's not to say we shouldn't be doing the innovative research, but we also need to look at the balance between the two, which shows us that there's a whole world of mid-tech sectors that may not be the next Sasol, but can bring about significant growth to the industrial structure and support economic growth There's also the challenge of diffusion to marginalized producers who desperately need even basic technologies from the formal sector. For instance, township mechanics who now can't compete unless they have access to computerized technologies. It's not cutting-edge technologies, but for them, it's a major innovation. How then do we see innovation being effectively located in our industry? And how does government coordinate its efforts so that there's a coherent support framework that drives the kind of innovation that will result in greater levels of industrial development? The starting point here for me is to understand the nature of the different enterprises that require policy support. And it's to understand that not all businesses are the same, and the policy framework needs to capture that. Otherwise, you end up aiming either too high or too low instead of providing appropriate support for enterprises who require it, and which will contribute to growth and employment creation. Further, there are significant blockages to innovation that will vary according to the type of enterprise involved, and very importantly, the sector. TIPS research has identified 4 major groups of enterprise in this regard. The first category would be large exporting companies. The second, small high-tech companies and design enterprises, the high innovators. The third category would be formal sector companies where innovation is not given much attention. And the last one would be emerging small and informal producers without access to innovation opportunities. So touching on the first one, our large exporting companies. So South Africa's large exporters play a crucial role as sources of innovation, providing substantial funding and sustaining international competitiveness in exports. Any effective innovation strategy for industrial policy has to build on their strengths. Companies here include the large exporting companies in the mining value chain and the supporting enterprises in the capital goods and components production. These enterprises are internationally competitive in terms of innovation, and the mining value chain is one of the few with significant domestic innovation capacity and systems, as well as world-class intellectual property. This highlights the importance of support to that sector and the growth potential which exists upstream of mining and in capital equipment. And we've seen over the past 2 years and arising out of the mining pakisa, significant work taking place to strengthen research and innovation capacity in this mining capital equipment sector, and that was touched on by the Minister, and there's a session on it later in the program. We also see in the petrochemicals and chemical sector that there is which is particularly important as a base for innovation. The challenge is both to enable them to compete with imports as well as expand exports, and to also strengthen the spillover effects. And that in turn requires, above all, making it easier for them to obtain skills. A qualitative improvement in the skills picture requires stronger measures that ensure school leavers have the competencies required by the economy. rather than a narrow focus on post-school education and training, and I'm sure we'll have some useful insights on that. The next category that we look at is the high innovators. Small high innovators are usually small companies, often highly skilled and creative, and when we say small, it would be between, say, 20 and 50 employees, and they often provide key inputs for larger companies, particularly in the engineering and software production space. In practice, they are crucial for innovation and play a disproportionate role in support of innovation. They are, however, hard to identify in the economy, both because they comprise a very small share of enterprise and employment, and because they act principally in support of larger enterprises and public enterprises. A critical issue for closing the knowledge gap is how these enterprises could take advantage of broad production, markets, and diffusion systems. Our research shows that their main constraint also lies in skills shortage and lack of financing. Even more than for other enterprises, they require a broad-based skills strategy rooted in substantial improvements in basic education. The next category is the formal sector, but in this category, it's the types of companies where innovation is a non-issue, and this might arise for different reasons. One, they might be linked to global operations where innovation takes place in other countries, and they operate under license and do basic assembly or formulation. For example, pharmaceuticals or media, although increasingly we're seeing local capacity and local companies who are operating in the first two categorizations that I mentioned. The second reason why they may not be engaging in innovation would be that they lack the resources or appetite for such activities. Typically, they use fairly advanced technologies, but they're not pushing the envelope to improve it. Interventions here could be strengthened by developing a more systematic approach with specific support measures, identifying key risks and ways to mitigate them, and venture capital. Our last category is around marginal producers. So small and emerging informal producers who have virtually no access to knowledge networks, technical support, innovation, infrastructure, or funding to support their technologies to the level found in the formal sector. Their main obstacle to innovation is the lack of market access for new or more efficiently produced goods and services, as well as inadequate information on innovative options, weaker skills, and insufficient investment finance. And there are initiatives that do try to address some of these weaknesses, but we don't see a comprehensive strategy or support structure for these types of producers. And marginalized producers are, by definition, largely excluded from knowledge flows in the national innovation system. So to innovate, they require information, technical support, financing, inputs, and marketing. And structures to support innovation and growth have to be tailored to meet the needs of specific subsectors and locations. Just touching on the employment impacts before I conclude, I think a core issue, and it's been spoken about it already, is how innovation in the formal sector outside of the export industries can bring around greater employment, and the impact of innovation, especially in the production processes and work organization, often aims to reduce the amount of resources that are required, including labor. In this case, unless the scale of production climbs at least proportionately to the growth in productivity, innovation can then lead to job losses. Something that's critical to consider with the kind of unemployment levels that exist in South Africa. However, that should not result in less support for innovation. We can't bury our heads on that, because it's critical to industrial development and competitiveness, and therefore it requires, and looking at the labor issue, therefore requires a constant focus on employment creation, new enterprise development, and increased level of investment in additional capacity. The reality is that for growth to take place, it requires improvements in technology. The challenge is to unlock innovations that help to bring about employment and increase production rather than displacing them to cut costs. Any innovation strategy in the South African context must take into account the impact on employment. Okay, so to conclude, innovation that fits with our context and industry. In order to promote innovation, a more effective strategy is required for each of these groups, and that would require work to take place on sectoral interventions to support innovation. A significant amount of work has already been done and contained in the Industrial Policy Action Plan. Indeed, virtually every sector of IPAP includes programs to support innovation. And the Minister hasn't touched on them, so I will. The first one is linking innovation to sector and sector and cluster institutions that can integrate technological advances consistently with measures to support skills development, marketing, and access to finance. The second one is provision of advice about technologies, work organization, and market demand to enterprises. The third one, improving access to key inputs for innovation, particularly through skills development. And the fourth one is bolstering effective demand for innovative products, encouraging local procurement, and supporting export marketing. And importantly, subsidizing users, for example, with solar water heaters, which stimulated a huge market. And fifthly, developing a regulatory framework that encourages innovation, amongst others, by reducing the cost through tax incentive, rebates, regulation of input prices, and setting standards. Okay, so some key issues that I would like you to give thought to as you're going through the conference is the strong linkages between industrial and innovation policies, not just carving out areas with advanced technologies as innovation, but rather looking at how innovation can support industrialization across all sectors. Is there a synergy between youth, innovation, and small business? And how do we unlock that in a meaningful way? And lastly, effective mechanisms to support collaboration between the national system of innovation, the different categories of firms, in order to support industrial upgrading. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saul. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will take a 5-minute break to enjoy some entertainment from the Soweto Opera Quadro. And straight after that, we'll then hear it from Jorge Maia, who will speak on trends in and outlook for the global and South African economies, as well as Sizwe Nxasana to speak on skills and innovation as a driver for industrial development in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The beautiful sounds of the Soweto Opera Quadro. So for those of you who've just joined us, welcome. Remember to continue the conversations on social media. We are at CSIR on Twitter and CSIR South Africa on Facebook and on Instagram. And the hashtag, of course, is behind me, CSIR Conf 2017. So, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, Jorge Maia, joined the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa Limited, the IDC, in 1995 as a manager in the Department of Economic Research and Development. In mid-1999, he was appointed to the position of Senior Project Manager in the IDC's newly created SADC department, and approximately 1 year later to head of his department. And early in 2003, the department was renamed the Africa Unit. In 2004, he was seconded to Dynasty Textiles, a cotton spinning operation based in Cape Town, to implement a merger between this company and Prilla 2000 Proprietary Limited. In May 2005, he was appointed head of the Research and Information Department of the IDC. And he holds a Master of Arts degree in Economics from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. A round of applause, please, for Jorge Maia, the head of the Research and Information Department of the IDC.
Thank you, Program Director, and Dr. Thulani Dlamini, CEO of the CSIR, Mr. Saul Levin, Mr. Sizwe Nxasana, Dr. Philip Goyns, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you. I would firstly like to thank Dr. Dlamini for the kind invitation to address you all this morning. It's an absolute pleasure to do so. I have been asked to say a few words about trends in the global and South African economy, as well as the outlook for the economy as we see it in the research unit of the IDC. I must say at the outset that the size of the screen is an economist's dream. It is fabulous to be able to show charts effectively. I'm also very glad that I'm the first one to use charts and a PowerPoint presentation, so you're not yet tired. So to start off with, the presentation layout is quite simple. I'll start with the global economy and then move on to the South African economy and taking you through some of the recent developments and then ending up with the outlook. At this point in time, if we look at the global environment, we all have reasons for being concerned, and this is due to several factors: political, social, economic. So it's very difficult for you to really grasp the opening statement of this slide, which is that the world economy's pace of expansion is expected to increase. But the fact is that the world economy is indeed improving. Last year was not a particularly good year, and you can see that the downward trend in global growth, as shown by that solid line, has been quite pronounced for quite a number of years and reached, hopefully, a bottom in 2016. So basically, I'm showing that point over there. And when you look at the presentation in hard copy format, you'll be able to see that really two of the major contributors to this decline were, in fact, the United States, which is shown here. This is the contribution made by the United States to overall global GDP growth, as well as the EU, because both of them shrank relative to the previous year. Now, going forward, both these economies are expected to post significantly better growth. We're already seeing the signs of this happening this year, and this lays the foundation then for a significant momentum going forward. You also have the economy of China not decelerating to the extent that had been anticipated. So, as you will see a little bit later, a significant contribution also expected from that. So global growth could really, according to the IMF, increase significantly and get closer to the 3.8% at the end of the outlook period in 2022. This momentum will imply that the world will again start investing in its economy. So economic agents that have been holding back for quite some time on investment activity because demand conditions were not necessarily there, will start investing again in a more broader form than up until now. Up until now, we all know that China has been the key driver of that investment. Now it will be more broad-based. That in turn will have a demand for raw materials, for intermediate products, for finished goods, etc., which will benefit an economy like ours. That will lead also to foreign direct investment flows to accelerate worldwide, which should also benefit economies such as ours and those of other African countries and emerging markets at large. It's expected that inflationary pressures will remain relatively subdued. We still have a good balance between demand and supply. There's no reason to expect that the world economy will be in overdrive, and therefore this could also permit what is expected, which is the gradual normalization of monetary policies across the advanced world. One important aspect is the last statement that is made here, and that is trading relationships between the major economic powers may be altered to some extent. And this could be triggered by what we know very well, which are the very well-publicized views of the Trump administration in the United States. Let us now just look at some of the key economies from the global perspective, from a South African perspective. The United States. So growth in the United States is then expected to be sustained at a relatively modest pace, more or less around 2% per annum, with the key drivers of this growth over the outlook period being then consumer and investment spending. Low inflationary pressures, as I said, and the Federal Reserve expected to gradually hike policy rates, reduce and unwind the quantitative easing program that it had to utilize during this difficult phase post-global financial crisis. One is expecting, as we've been hearing a lot, as time goes by, increased investment in infrastructure in the American economy. There is no need. I mean, there's no doubt that the American infrastructure network needs quite a bit of upgrading, expansion, and so on. For many years, there's been a degree of neglect. So this investment on infrastructure will be also a trigger for a better performance by the economy. And the US is still the largest economy in the world, contributing close to 25% of world GDP. It accounts for about 9% of world exports. It's also the source of almost 21% of global FDI outflows in 2016. Now, that is a significant player in the global investment scene. As far as South Africa is concerned, it is a key destination for our exports. About 7% of our exports go to the United States, and some 6% of the FDI stock in our country belongs to American companies, so quite significant. The EU, a very important economy for South Africa. It accounts for this regional economy accounts for about 23% of our exports. So what happens in the EU is critical for us in terms of our own performance. It is also the source of 78% of FDI stock in our country. So a major investor. Of course, we're talking about numerous economies, about 28 economies. So this is a very important economy for us. Moderate growth is expected over the outlook period, as you can see from the graph, due to higher confidence levels, both amongst businesses and consumers. And a very important aspect here is what has happened recently in terms of the political system, the political aspects of the EU. So elections that have been pro-EU in Austria, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany. So you still have confidence in the EU, despite, especially in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. The ECB, the European Central Bank, is expected to start unwinding the quantitative easing program and eventually to start raising policy rates. The pace of growth is becoming more broad-based. That is no longer just a few core economies in the EU, but spreading also to the periphery countries, your Portugals, your Italy's, etc., coming to the fore. Spain is posting very, very robust growth in recent times. And the trade performance of the EU will surely be altered by the Brexit, by the exit of the United Kingdom from the EU, without a doubt. But there will also be the possibility of changing trade relations with the United States. Time will tell. So this may pose a degree of difficulty for the EU per se. In terms of Japan, the economy of Japan has been in quite a low growth trajectory, as shown by the graph. If you remember in the first slide that I showed you, you can hardly see the presence of Japan as a contributor to world growth, and it's because of this. We believe that the stimulation that is provided by governmental measures is supporting to some extent a better growth trajectory going forward. But long-term growth in Japan is still being held back by structural constraints. And a very important one is the demographics. Quite a relatively old population in Japan, which then has implications on growth. Japan is also a very important economy for South Africa, as shown. In the case of China, the restructuring of the Chinese economy is continuing, so moving from an heavily export-oriented and investment-driven economy to more of a domestic consumer-oriented economy, also reliant more on services, high-tech manufacturing, etc. So that rebalancing will carry on. The growth deceleration, which remember is quite a lot of it has been as a result of central government planning, is expected to be bottoming out, stabilizing at lower, but nevertheless sturdy rates. You know, when we talk about 6% growth for the world's second largest economy, that is a lot. On a yearly basis, that is a lot of momentum. So the fact that you see this continuously declining growth trend, just remember that that point over there is something like that, right? Now, when we talk about the South African economy, you will see where we may be in 2022, which is not even half of that growth rate. So China, very important for us, becoming, it's already the source of 3% of the foreign direct investment stock in our country, and it is the destination of just over 9% of our exports. In the case of the rest of Africa, so the African continent, excluding South Africa, a moderate recovery is expected over the short term on the back of improving global demand conditions. And one expects then the African continent, to post higher levels of exports. This will also be supported by improving conditions in commodity markets, both in terms of volume demand and prices. And all in all, this will lead to investment activity within the continent, which again supports the growth trajectory. Reduced liquidity constraints are also expected in several economies as the outlook period unfolds. The likes of Mozambique, as you know, facing quite a liquidity challenge at this point in time, Nigeria, Angola, and so on, and some of it on the back of higher oil prices. The continent currently accounts for almost 28% of South Africa's exports. So what happens in the continent is very important for us. And we expect that South Africa will play a greater and greater role as time goes by in the continent. It's also the source of about 3% of FDI stock in South Africa. The economies that I've just shown you, for you to see why have I focused on these, this is the reason. They basically, in terms of FDI, they account for 93% of the FDI in our country. So what happens in these economies as sources of foreign direct investment matters to us. These economies are also the destination for 72% of our exports, basically 3/4. So it does matter, right? Hence, having spent a little bit of time on this. My starting remarks were about, the unsettling times that we are facing globally, right? These are difficult times, especially from geopolitical tensions and so on and so forth. We believe that the global political order is really being challenged quite significantly. And you've been hearing of this multipolarity gaining momentum that is unlike a world that has been dominated by one or two powers, right? You're starting to see this spread of power with a number of major powers in the world wishing to take a more leading position. The inward orientation of the United States administration, these nationalist tendencies that are emerging in various parts of the world, the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, Turkey, etc. It's concerning. The regionalism becoming under increased scrutiny, especially as we know when it came to the European Union, but others as well. Globalization being challenged, obviously because globalization thus far, even though it has brought about many positive results or benefits for the world at large, it has also not been necessarily fair. And it has led to a lot of inequality. So this is being challenged. So a new way of spreading the benefits of globalization has to be looked at. And there's worrying signs of deteriorating commitments to global cooperation. We saw the recent meeting of the UN General Assembly, which did not talk a lot to multilateralism. It was more about look after yourself. That is a problem. You know, when we have countries saying, my country first, and that happens all over the place, then regional, global cooperation is diminishing. And the divides between North and South, East and West are, of course, becoming more pronounced. On the right-hand side, I think I don't have to cover it. You can see some of the key risks that we are facing as a globe. Turning to the South African economy. South Africa is out of a technical recession. Now, this is a term used by economists for when you have 2 consecutive quarters of decline in gross domestic product in real terms. So we out of recession because in the second quarter of this year, we posted positive growth. This was the technical recession here. This was a full-fledged recession in 2009. So we're out of it, but we must bear in mind that the recovery that we saw in this second quarter is off a low base. That's number one. Number two, the agricultural sector was the main contributor to this recovery. It accounted for 0.7% of a 0.7 of a percentage point, and this was largely due to the rebound from one of the worst droughts on record, if not the worst, right? So we started having substantially higher agricultural output, which then translated into this kind of performance by the agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector's GDP on a quarter-on-quarter basis increased by about 33%. Now that's the main contributor. If you look at others, electricity, mining, finance, transport, manufacturing, a relatively small contribution, but the others, and construction, still in negative territory, and government having to tighten the belt for obvious reasons. So this really shows that if we had not had agriculture in the equation, we would have had a much smaller rate of growth in the second quarter of the year. Manufacturing output rebounded by 1.5% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. This followed 3 consecutive quarters of decline. So the manufacturing sector also emerged from recession. However, the story is not necessarily positive across the board. This slide covers the various broad sectors of manufacturing. You basically have the colors reflecting sequentially the various quarters from quarter 3 2016 all the way through to the second quarter of 2017. This is the whole manufacturing sector. The 1.5 that I talked about is this. But you can see that the rebound was mainly due to higher production of food and beverages, that one, transport equipment, that one, and radio, television, and communication equipment. You may, why am I giving it to you in this sequence? It's because of the shares that each one of these has in the overall manufacturing production. So food and beverages accounts for about 24% of the output of South Africa's manufacturing sector. So when it grows by this, it makes a significantly higher contribution. But even though there's been a recovery in these specific sectors, you still have others that are in recession. So certain subsectors of manufacturing are still in recession. An example is wood and paper. Clothing and textiles is in recession. Chemicals the same. So you can see that it is really quite an unequal distribution across the manufacturing sector. So we can say that the sector is still under strain. In the case of mining, there was an improvement in recent times in terms of its output. You can see 5.1% growth in the first semester of 2017 relative to the equivalent period a year ago. But as you can see from this longer-term chart depicting the trend in the mining sector's volume of production, this is where we are. We're still considerably below where we were not too long ago, and well below the peak of the commodities boom, as Saul was referring to. And this rebound, the rebound that you saw in mining is, of course, as I said before, off a low base. Consumers. Now, I've been talking a little bit about the production side of the economy. Now let's talk a little bit about the expenditure side. So GDP is, in simple terms, can be measured on the production side or on the expenditure side. So let's talk a little bit about the spending side. Consumers, consumer spending or household spending. South African consumers are going through very difficult times. Firstly, the unemployment rate has increased. So households will have, in many instances, unemployed members. Disposable incomes are growing at a subdued pace. Even though the households have been trying to reduce their debt levels, they still remain relatively high. Employment prospects are unsatisfactory. Inflation is still there, eating away their purses. The weak economic climate, as well as the concerns they have with the environment around them, some of it due to political reasons, are holding back, or making them hold back on their spending. So it's not just about the ability of South African consumers to spend, it's also about the willingness to spend. So, confidence levels amongst consumers in South Africa has been declining, as shown by this dark line. This is then reflecting in purchases. And this is now shown in terms of the growth rates in retail trade sales in South Africa. And as you can see, the growth rates in retail sales getting lower and lower and lower. And in the first quarter of this year, they turned negative. That was one of the main contributors to us entering into a de facto technical recession. And there's been a recovery in the second quarter of this year. Nevertheless, despite this recovery, which shows a degree of resilience, challenges do remain. The recent lowering of the repo rate, and therefore prime, by the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank should provide some relief to consumers, but we don't think that they will be going out there to spend in a hurry. I think they are concerned enough to hold back in spending for quite some time. Another very important, by the way, I wanted to point out that some 60% of South Africa's GDP is directly related to household spending. So what consumers do, what households do, is reflected by that much in GDP. In the case of fixed investment activity is also absolutely critical for any economy. It creates this additional demand for goods and services, it creates employment, and therefore a virtuous cycle throughout the economy. Fixed investment spending by the private sector in South Africa has been declining in real terms since 2015. It shrank by 1.4% in real terms, that is removing inflation, in 2015, almost 7% in 2016, and declined further in the first half of 2017. This has been in line, so the decline I've been talking about is shown by this line here, and it's in line with what has been happening with business confidence. Business confidence has also been on a continuous decline. To explain this business confidence level, that is the line which takes you to zero. Above that, a net balance of respondents is optimistic. Below zero, a net balance of respondents are pessimistic. This is basically where we are. So this shows that there is no inclination at this point in time for the private sector or businesses to invest in bricks and mortar. They will invest in machinery and equipment, sure. There's a degree of maintenance that needs to be done, but they're doing it cautiously. So they're waiting, it goes back to what Saul Levin said earlier, that business confidence and consumer confidence are critical, and business is looking at what households are doing, and they're looking also at global conditions, right? So they will respond, they will start responding, as we will see later, to what is happening globally, exports, etc. But those that are servicing mainly the domestic market will be still in cautious mode for quite some time. And this is reflected in a way in the next slide, which then talks about how do manufacturers in our country expect, what sort of conditions do they expect in 12 months' time? And therefore, this will influence their own fixed investment activity. As shown by the graph, they are quite pessimistic about conditions in 12 months' time. And if several manufacturing subsectors are facing excess production capacity, they are facing subdued demand locally, they are unlikely to find any justification to invest further, right? So they will wait for, first of all, for demand to increase, secondly, for production capacity to be closer to what is termed full utilization, which is not 100%, and then they will start planning future investment activity. There's also been supply-side constraints, especially cost pressures on infrastructure related services. This has also affected their investment decisions. But we believe that some manufacturing sectors will start responding quite significantly to what is happening in terms of global demand, and therefore taking opportunities opened up in the export sector. The export sector is what we think is going to be the crucial driver of growth in the South African economy in the short term. It may not look like it when you see that this was the growth, a marginal contraction in the first half of this year, if you annualize it, dragged down by manufacturing exports. But this has a lot to do with specific markets. I'll give you an example right here. You'll see that a number of global markets contributed to that marginally negative performance of exports in the economy, and that was principally the United States and our neighboring states in the South African Customs Union. But the United States, the bulk of the reason for that contraction in exports to the United States in the first half of this year was motor vehicles, parts and accessories. We believe there's reasons for this to turn around, and therefore, as you will see in the last slide of my presentation, exports should be a good driver of growth in relative terms in the short term. Government finances, another contributor to GDP on the spending side, are under strain. We all know that the fiscal space of the South African National Treasury is limited. The fiscal deficit has remained large at an average of about 3.5% of GDP over the past 4 years. There's been a squeeze in revenues, so tax collections by the state have come under a lot of stress because the economy is not performing well. And therefore, they've been having to contain expenditure in order to do a fine balancing act between what they receive from taxpayers and what they can spend on. Government debt is being very closely monitored by the credit rating agencies, which are concerned with the very high and rising government guarantees to financially vulnerable state-owned enterprises, especially Eskom, South African Airways. The gross loan debt, this is shown here. I mean, this is data from the budget review of 2017. This is government debt on the red line, and it reflects what is stated here, that gross loan debt stood at 2.3 trillion rand in June 2017. That's more than double the figure of 6 years ago. If you put this as a percentage of GDP, you have this line. If you now add the guarantees that government is also providing to state-owned enterprises, the red line then jumps to the blue line. Now, this is really what is very concerning to the rating agencies, right? The higher government debt is resulting in much higher debt servicing costs. And if you think about it, I mean, out of the whole kitty that the state is able to spend on an annual basis, about 11.2% of total expenditure is going just to service that debt. So it is something that you need to hold, to contain. And without a doubt, the government is showing its commitment to fiscal consolidation. We need to see that translating into fact, right? With all of this, the economy has not been able really to create jobs. In fact, if you look at employment levels in the informal and formal sectors of the economy in the second quarter of this year, compared to the previous quarter, so the opening quarter of the year, 113,000 job losses occurred. You can see the spread. The biggest losses in construction, agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining, and the list goes on. Where the gains have been made, trade, catering and accommodation, that's your retail trade, wholesale trade, catering and accommodation, and in a way ties to what you saw in the retail trade sales for the second quarter having risen, right? The financial and business services sector, and to some extent in manufacturing. Quite a bit of this manufacturing employment gains oriented towards exports, as I said earlier. The unemployment rate remained at 27.7%. However, unless the economy starts really growing at a faster pace, we are going to see this unemployment rate rise further. Indeed, the subdued growth prospects for the economy in the short to medium term do not bode very well for a meaningful recovery in employment in South Africa. Now, turning to the outlook for the economy, this is the last section. Our base case we've modeled as we call our base case, right? And the base case forecasts are underpinned by the following assumptions. It's always important to talk about some assumptions so that everybody can start saying, okay, but what if you had done this? What if you had done that? One of them is that the political landscape remains characterized by a certain degree of uncertainty until the 2019 elections. Number two, that the South African sovereign credit ratings are not downgraded further into sub-investment levels. So remember, there's 3 rating agencies. Not all of them have put us there in sub-investment, so this the status quo is maintained, that business and consumer confidence show a gradual recovery going forward, supporting then a revival in production activity, in fixed investment and consumption expenditure over the medium term. The currency is expected to depreciate more or less in line with inflation differentials, and this will provide a degree of support to exporters. Lower inflationary pressures in the economy provide some room for the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank to reduce interest rates a bit more. Globally, it's based on what you saw in the opening slides. So the International Monetary Fund forecasts, we've taken those as for our base. Commodity prices expected to move slightly higher throughout the outlook period, but to remain well below the peaks reached in 2011. And because there will be somewhat higher inflation globally, there will also be this gradual normalization of policy rates in advanced economies. Having said this, we then, looking at the South African forecasts, inflation and interest rates expected to moderate. CPI, which peaked at an average of 6.6% in the last quarter of 2016, is now estimated to decline to about an average of 5.6% this year, and to drop further to just over 5% next year. This will be mostly due to lower food prices, subdued domestic demand throughout this shorter-term period, and a stronger currency. So the currency is relatively stronger, so this alleviates then imported inflation. This inflation outlook then provides some scope, but very limited scope, for what we call more accommodative or growth-supporting monetary policy by the South African Reserve Bank. And we expect then that the repo rate could be lowered by another 25 basis points in the first quarter of 2018, followed by a further drop of 25 basis points maybe a year later. Remember, interest rate differentials in real terms are very important for capital flows. So if South Africa is to attract foreign capital, it needs to maintain an attractive real interest rate differential. Now this, at a time when advanced economies are expected to gradually raise their interest rates, right? Their inflation environment remains quite subdued. So there isn't much room for us to move on the interest rate side. Otherwise, you could start having a strong degree of capital looking for higher yields elsewhere in the world, right? And that would affect the currency. By affecting the currency, it affects imported inflation, it affects domestic inflation. And then they're forced to raise interest rates. So it's a very fine balance. So that is what we saw in terms of the financial variables. In terms of consumer spending or household spending, to remain under pressure in the short term. So the willingness and ability of consumers to raise their spending will be limited in the short term, but we expect, so this is now shown by the little lime green bars, very marginal growth expected this year, improving very gradually as the outlook period carries on. Now, sometimes the argument is put forward that economists always tend to be optimistic when we look forward, right? The trend line is always up. The point is that if you look at what happens here, that is actually quite flat, right? I mean, these are very, very modest rates of growth in consumer spending. And you can see that it will benefit to some extent to a considerable extent, the durable goods sector. Now that includes your motor vehicles, your furniture, and so on and so forth, which has been under a lot of duress. Look at this negative spending on durable goods for quite a long time. So this has created such a low base that when consumers start spending, you will see the results positively. So these items such as motor vehicles, furniture, etc., will start benefit, hopefully, in the medium to longer term. In terms of fixed investment activity, as I said before, at this point in time, we have a number of sectors of the economy with surplus production capacity. So, no need to invest in additional capacity. They will invest in maintenance of machinery and equipment. Also, in the immediate term or the very near term, there's still a lot of concern over political developments, so they're waiting and seeing. They're also looking at what the credit rating agencies will be doing, right? So that's another aspect or factor that is weighing heavily on investor decision-making, right? Both the private and public sectors are forecast to cut back on fixed investment spending in the short term. That is in 2017. This is the negative bar that you've got there. But a gradual recovery is expected in the medium term and accelerating significantly as time goes by. Now, what is likely to draw this interest in investing again is, as I said before, importantly, the export opportunities. So, a South African private sector looking at what is happening globally, taking advantage, the currency for the moment supporting in terms of overall competitiveness, they will be looking for these opportunities. There's a number of sectors where that is quite clear, and we believe that general government is only going to be able to come to the fore later on in the outlook period. In the earlier stages of this outlook period, general government will be still under significant constraints because the fiscal position the fiscal space remains quite limited. The budget, this talks then to the fiscal space. The budget balance, so the fiscal balance as a percentage of GDP, is currently more or less around here. As you can see, a deficit. We expect a gradual improvement in this deficit position, so a lower deficit as time goes by, with government remaining then committed to fiscal consolidation. We will see later in the month how the National Treasury views this trajectory. This is our viewpoint. And the very important aspect, which is government debt. We expect government debt, excluding then guarantees, right, to the state-owned enterprises, to peak at 23% in 2019, and then to slowly start declining after that. If this is the trajectory, it will be a welcome trajectory, and I think it will reflect well in the decisions made by the rating agencies. The last slide is this one. This slide really covers our expectations for the economy's performance going forward. This is shown. So GDP growth, or economic growth, represented by the black line, and the contributors to that growth are the various blocks that you've got here. The positive contributors minus the negative ones, taking you to the line. Now, the negative contributor is, of course, imports, right? So that is where you have the red coming through. But on occasion, you also have others that are contributing negatively. I did say that fixed investment is expected to contract this year, hence this small gray negative contribution to growth this year. I talked about net exports, not net exports, exports being the key driver of growth in the short term. That's your yellow block, or lime. As you can see, here is the contribution made by exports to growth, which is quite significant over time. Consumer spending, which is the blue portion of the bar, very timid in 2017, growing gradually, but nothing really to brag about over the longer term. In the case of fixed investment spending, from this contraction expected this year, slightly positive next year, just underneath that black line, and expanding significantly going forward. Now, this is based on those assumptions that we have made, that I stated right at the start. It's one scenario. We have also modeled other scenarios. We called one of them, for lack of a better term, the high road scenario, the other one a low road scenario. Each one of them with their own sets of assumptions, typically more biased towards what happens domestically in terms of political developments, in terms of what the political developments imply for business and consumer confidence, what that translates into in terms of reactions by the credit rating agencies. In the low scenario, for example, you have significant degree of political uncertainty and turmoil, so then leading to further fall in consumer confidence, in business confidence, rating agencies downgrading South Africa to junk status across the board, and so on. This then has an impact on capital outflows, which then affects the level of the currency, inflation, interest rates, and so on. That's the low road scenario. The high road scenario is the reverse. A much greater degree of political stability post-December 2017. Business and consumers reacting favorably to this, and the reverse of what I said for the low road scenario applies. When you look at the results, which of course I cannot really share with you, I don't have enough time for that today, but we can leave it for another time. When you see the results are quite glaringly distinct relative to the base case. And the implications on the low road scenarios show you what this could mean in terms of employment losses in our country. To give you an example, fixed investment, the level of fixed investment by the end of the period would be some 17% lower than in the base case. GDP would be some 7% lower. So you can imagine what happens then to the unemployment rate. The high road on the other side, which is possible, the high road scenario is possible, shows not the mirror image, not at all, but it shows where we could be if we could really turn around things meaningfully. So it really leaves us with many important choices to make. Those important choices are not just made by politicians, they're made by all stakeholders across the board, all of you, and we can make a difference. And we certainly believe that this is not the kind of scenario that South Africa should be aiming for. This is a very modest growth scenario. As I said earlier on, this 2.8% that we've got here, which is the growth rate projected for 2022, is less than half that of China's, at just about 6%. And that's the world's second largest economy. So we can certainly do more, and we should. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much, George. So, ladies and gentlemen, remember to continue tweeting at CSIR, hashtag CSIRConf 2017. So, the next speaker that I'd like to call to the podium is one gentleman that I am particularly fond of. I mean, not that I'm not fond of the rest of you gentlemen. I absolutely have what's called an intellectual crush on every single one of you. Thick, juicy brains filled with solutions. So, Dr. Sizwe Nxasana, began his career at Unilever and went on to establish what was the first black-owned audit practice in KZN in 1996, Sizwe & Co. And he became the founding partner of Nkonki Sizwe Nxasana, now called Sizwe Nxasana Gobodo, which is the 5th largest audit firm in the country. And in 1998, he joined Telkom South Africa as Chief Executive Officer and was responsible for its listing on the JSE and the New York Stock Exchanges. He was the CEO of First Rand Banking Group since 2005 until he retired in September 2015. Sizwe serves as a chairman on various foundations and trusts, and he was appointed chairman of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS, in August 2015, and the chairman of the Ministerial Task Team, developing a new funding model for students who come from poor and what is known as missing middle backgrounds. So today he's a social entrepreneur who recently founded Future Nation Schools, which is a chain of affordable private schools in the country. He also founded Fiso Learning Group, which is involved in edtech, academic publishing, and real estate. So some of you may know that Sizwe has been conferred with honorary doctorates by the universities of Fort Hare, the Durban University of Technology, the University of Johannesburg, and the Walter Sisulu University. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Sizwe Nxasana.
Thanks very much, Masi Chaba, for that introduction. I'm not used to being called doctor, but I know there are a lot of doctors here. But at least they worked for their doctorates. Some of us sort of winged it and sort of ended up with doctorates. So thanks very much, Dr. Thulani, Dlamini, my buddy. We went to the same school. He's much younger than me. And, my fellow panelists here, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I know we're running a little bit late, so I've decided I'm going to skip a couple of slides in my presentation, but touch on some of the key points in particularly dealing with the kind of skills that we require to not just drive innovation to grow our economy and to grow industrial development in the country. And I'm going to start off by just looking at and painting a picture of where education is in South Africa. You will know, of course, for instance, South Africa participates in the TIM study, which are the trends in international studies on mathematics and science. We're starting to see some green shoots there, where South Africa is sort of increased and improved in the rankings. But I think it's fair to say that we still have a long way to go, especially given that there's a whole revolution that's taking place in education, because it's one of the sectors that even more than 100 years has not really changed in terms of how learning and teaching takes place. But yet, when you look at what the employers and what the economy requires, we need a lot more children who can think critically, who can be analytical, who are adaptable. The fourth industrial revolution, already which is upon us, requires a very different set of skills than the skills that we continue to produce in the country. And as we know, we have slid, we have gone down in terms of our rankings in the World Economic Forum rankings. We're 47th and 48th about a year or two ago. We're now 61st, which means we're going backwards in a number of indicators that are important for our industrial development particularly. So we've got to really pause and say, what do we do? There's a sense of agency, an absolute sense of agency in terms of some of the things we need to do to address, especially in the education landscape. So our future competitiveness obviously relies and will continue to rely on our ability to produce not only the skills and the pipeline of skills in the science, engineering, technology areas, but also in the arts, because if we look at how technology going forward is going to evolve, is going to be integrated with different things. The arts, which have been undermined in the country, are going to become not less, but more important. And in the past decade, if you look at South Africa, especially the pipeline that we have in science and engineering and technology, you see that we actually have been stagnant. And the recent statistics that were released in the report that was released last week by the National Advisory Council for Innovations indicates that, you know, we've been sitting at somewhere between 28.7 to 29.9 in the skills that and enrollments that we have in the science, engineering, and technology fields. This has to be a worrying factor. And I'll touch on why this is so, especially as I look at the slide here. So if you look at this slide, there are a couple of points, and I'm just going to pause on the slide a little bit. It shows the demographic profile of our young people, and I want to go back, not just our young people from the ages of 14 to 34, but go back to even our neonates, and just look at what's going on there. So we have somewhere in the region about 4 million kids before the age or below the age of 6 in the country. Out of those children, we have about 1 million of those children that are in early childhood development centers, in ECD centers. Now, there are a couple of things there. For starters, it means about 3 million of our children below the age of 6 are not exposed or not going to any childhood development center. So that home, you know, they've got gogos and mothers and parents who are looking after them. As we know, child development starts right there. When children, you know, are, you know, in their first year, that's when they start developing their synapses in their brains and so on. So as a country, we've done well in putting, you know, at least 1 million children in ECD centers, but there's still a lot of children out there who are not going to ECD centers. Why is this important? If you just analyze and you read the TIM study that South Africa participates in, by grade 3, there's a very clear stats that shows that those children that have been to proper ECD centers by grade 3 achieve what I would call an average performance. In terms of this team study, out of total about 600 points, they would achieve about 400 or so. If they've been to a play center, they achieve about 300. If they've never been to an ECD center, they are below 300 points out of 600. So, you know, the evidence is right there that we've got to get more children into the ECD centers. But there's a principal and a primary policy issue which as a country we've got to take in this regard, with regards to the ECD environment. For starters, I think it's just wrong that early childhood development sits in the Department of Social Development. It shows that we're still thinking about early childhood development as social welfare, as opposed to it being education. We're going to transfer ECD completely out of DSD as far as I'm concerned, to basic education. The standards that are applied to, for instance, ECD practitioners are still extremely inconsistent in this country. Very often, ECD practitioners, even up to grade R practitioners, are not properly trained. They're not recognized. Their standards in terms of the level of education is very low. They're not properly compensated. Very often, they're compensated out of the SGB budget. So a lot of them earn below 3,000 Rand a month. And yet, these are the most critical people in our chain and production of the pipeline that we need. And then I go to basic education, and I work in that environment, you know, very closely now with the, you know, my involvement and being a co-founder of the National Education Collaboration Trust. The number of things that we have about 13 million kids that are in the public education system. And out of that 13 million, about 80% go to no-fee paying schools, the quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools, which is great. I think we've done well as a country to improve access, especially for the poor, to basic education. The problem, though, we know we still have a long way to go in improving the quality of education. Just a few numbers, and I won't bore you with a lot of statistics. Out of the 680,000 children or learners that write your matric, only about 6% do mathematics and achieve competence or results that are more than 60% in mathematics and science. So that translates to just over 40,000 kids out of the 680,000 kids that would have written matric last year. Now, that stat is particularly important because, as you know, that universities, particularly universities, and I'm going to touch on the TVET sector in a moment, the universities will only accept children into the SET, in other words, the science, engineering, and technology fields or faculties, if you've achieved at least 60% to be able to get into actuarial science, into engineering, into medicine, into accounting, and so on. So we're competing for a very small pool of children that exit out of matric with a symbol 60% plus. If you are kind and you reduce that number to about 50% passes in matric of mathematics, not math literacy. So I'm completely excluding math literacy because it does not get you into the SET faculties. Then that number improves to about 80,000 learners. But the issue is we cannot, as a country, increase our pipeline of children that are getting into the science, engineering, and technology as long as we have the numbers that we see in the basic education system. And then there's an issue of the children that end up unemployed or other non-economically active. So if you just take the numbers of the 13 million kids that we have in the basic education system, between the grades 9 to 12, we have somewhere in the region of about 300,000 children or learners that exit before they get to matric. 300,000 of them every year. So what happens to those kids? They add to this mustard, these two mustards that you see on the slide. We're supposed to catch some of them into community colleges or TVET, the TVET system. But a lot of them never actually make it there because even though the TVET sector, as an example, and I won't talk about community colleges for now, even though the TVET system is supposed to enroll learners or students from grade 9 onwards, very often they actually don't do that. They only enroll learners or students that have completed grade 12. So those children can't actually get back into the economy, into being active participants in the economy. And then I'll touch a little bit on the TVET sector that I've also got to understand a lot more. So there are three kinds of certification that you can, and I'm generalizing, I'm sort of creating or telling you broad categories here. There are three types of qualifications that you can have in the TVET system. Out of the 800,000 students that are in the TVET system today, about 700,000 of those are either doing what is called NATED programs, in other words, the N1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 programs, or they are doing the National Certificates Vocational, the NCVs. There's a lot of them who are doing the NATED programs than those that are doing NCVs. The problem with the NATED programs is that the curriculum for NATED programs is still based on post-war curriculum. I'm not sure whether a lot of you know this. So, and because of what's happened, especially with the integration or the connection or maybe the disintermediation of the NATED programs with the real world, a lot of them may do theoretical or even some practical courses at the TVET colleges, but they can never really complete because they lack the workplace-based programs, because most of them, the curriculum is not the kind of curriculum that companies or employers, because it's not just companies, that employers are actually looking for. So, I mean, you've seen the whole saga about the results in the TVET system, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that those students require a practical component which they can never have because the programs that they are doing are not relevant for employers. And that applies to some degree to the NCV programs as well. So the programs that really work in the TVET system are the occupational programs, which are funded by companies And obviously companies make sure, or employers make sure, that the curriculum for those programs and the training of lecturers for those programs, the workshops for those programs are up to scratch. So there's a significant number of students that are in the TVET system that actually, even if they graduate, never actually find their way to employment. If they do, they end up working maybe as waiters or waitresses in restaurants, not in the trades that they were trained for. And then you look at universities. You know, our universities rank very highly in the world, in the global rankings and so on. But if we are going to improve our innovation, especially industrial innovation, you know that we need to produce a lot more researchers. We need to produce a lot more postgraduate students. So we've done well as a country in that area. However, if you look at the researchers, doctoral as well as postdoctoral students that we're producing, especially in the SAT sector, the numbers have grown, but they've not kept pace with the growth in the numbers globally. So we've grown our own numbers, but as a percentage of researchers that we are producing in relation to the global stats, we actually are sort of growing, but the numbers are not growing enough for us to drive the industrialization of our economy, as well as the increase in innovation in our economy. Which then leaves me with the unemployed. So we're sitting in the country with about 2.6 million young people who are in the post-school education and training sector, but we're sitting with some 5.7 million kids or young people who are unemployed. So what do we do about this? We know that, you know, the Jobs Fund or even the expanded public works programs have been sort of effective, but, you know, have not been able to absorb the significant number of young people that we sit with that are in the mastered part of this pie chart. So we've got to do something about this. There are organizations that are trying to do something about this, such as Harambee. The private sector has come up with a concept called the Youth Employment Service, where they're targeting to employ at least 1 million of these unemployed young people. It's still in very early stages, but at least, you know, money has been, you know, put together, more than 1 billion rand, almost 1.5 billion rand has been put together by the private sector to address this. But what we do need is, obviously, not just government, private sector, and higher education institutions to do something about how we can retrain or train these unemployed young people, put them back in the economy. Because it's quite a major issue, and in fact, it's a ticking time bomb that we as a country are sitting with. Now, just turning back to the basic education system, just looking at the fourth industrial revolution that is upon us already, 65% of the students or learners that are in the primary school today are going to be doing jobs that do not exist. So we've got to think about how our education system is structured. I've spoken about the Early Childhood Development Center, or the ECD space as a whole, that it does need a complete overhaul in terms of how we are thinking about it and how we are implementing programs that future-proof our young children to be part of this fourth industrial revolution. You know, if you think about it, you know, Africa was completely bypassed by the first industrial revolution. We were maybe a subject because people were looking for resources for the second industrial revolution. In the third industrial revolution, which is where we started to see technology, we were in the periphery. So can we really afford, as Africa, to be left behind again in the fourth industrial revolution? And we face the danger of doing that if we don't fix our education system in South Africa. So just looking at some of the things that we've got to do. We've got to rethink all aspects of our curriculum, how we're training our teachers, the assessment tools, the access to the education system, the pedagogies that we have, the subjects or integration of the subject and so on, because just going back to my first slide, on my first two slides, the fourth industrial revolution requires very different skills. For instance, we've got to teach coding and robotics in primary school already. We're doing this already, and some of the schools, such as ourselves at Future Nation Schools, are doing this already. We've got to think differently about teaching subjects in silos, because the world has become a lot more integrated. We've got to think very differently about how we're training our teachers. So if you look at our country, I think it was a great idea to separate basic education from higher education. But what's happened? What's happened is that there's complete disintermediation of the curriculum that's taught very often at universities or colleges that are teacher training colleges compared to what happens in the classroom. Very often you have no practical experience of lecturers or people who are in the higher education sector or teacher training colleges with classroom practice. So you have these processes in basic education where there's remediation of the students that are now completed, that are completed the in-service teacher training and education as they get into pre-service, as they get into in-service itself. So we've got to really do something about how our system that produces the pipeline that you have actually functions. It is important for us to look at how the revolution that's taking place in the classroom may improve the way that we deliver learning and teaching. For instance, we have global classrooms now. We have future workplaces that are flexible. We have virtual augmented reality that can be used in the classroom. We have artificial intelligence that can address individual learning needs of our learners and students. So it's no longer good enough to simply say we're going to have tablets for every child, we're going to have a laptop for every child, because that's a given. So it's no longer enough for our children to know how to swipe. They've got to know how to create applications, how to run programs, how to be creative using technology. So yes, we are sort of now in the process of fully implementing our CAPS curriculum. But as we do so, and we've been trying to do this, over the last couple of years, the world has moved on. So we need new ways of how we're teaching our young children. So I've already touched on this. If you just think of some of the jobs that we take for granted today, very often all of us use apps. And, you just need to sit and ponder and remember that an iPhone or a smartphone, regardless of which smartphone you have, was not there 11 years ago. It wasn't there. We're still using BlackBerries and the old type of phones and so on. So if you look at just high-paying jobs that we have today in the technology space that didn't exist, and this is not just in the technology space. Minister Davies spoke about how these new technologies are affecting services industry, are affecting agriculture as an example. So if we're training, artisans as an example, they've got to be trained, because a plumber today is not the same kind of plumber. I'm sure you and I will have had experiences where you have electricians that come to your home, or you have plumbers that come to your home. You have these new pressure valves that they have no clue how they work, because they are all digital pumps. So you can't just train a plumber like how you used to train a plumber before. I've visited a number of TVET colleges, and for instance, just cars. I went to some TVET colleges. They still have the old Morris Minor engine, a 1962 Morris Minor engine in one of the TVET colleges, and that's where they're teaching, their students on drivetrains and combustion engines and braking systems and so on. But the reality, as we know, is that the cars that we drive today, have a very different architecture and technology. So you can imagine. That's why, a lot of those students can never really get into even the automotive sector as an example. If they do, that sector has to completely unteach those students and teach them new ways of how, the automotive sector functions today. But in addition to the content in the classroom, we've got to think about how we future-proof our children, because of the rapid change in technology itself. So it's not just mathematics and science. It's some of what often we regard as soft skills, which are actually even more important skills that our children are going to need. They're going to need more grit and the ability to deal with uncertainty. They're going to need more cognitive abilities. They're going to need more problem-solving skills, not less. So rote learning must be thrown out the window, because if we are still teaching in a way where the teacher is a fountain of knowledge standing in front of the class, we are actually mistaken, because often children come into the classroom with a huge amount of knowledge already. So we've got to teach children some of these skills that are really going to be important for them. And, you know, especially in the context of all this massive data that we have, social media and so on, how do you teach our children to be discerning, to be able to distinguish between important and critical information and rubbish information? Because every day we're fed with so much just rubbish information. So we must increase our focus also, as we do so, on producing ethical leaders. Because, I mean, as we know, we're facing a crisis of ethical leadership in our country. It doesn't matter. It's not just politically. It's not just, you know, in the private sector as well. We see, you know, what goes on in our news every day. And the schools are really where this should start, where ethical leadership and ethical behavior should actually start. Because if we do that, we've seen, for instance, you know, what's happened with some of the countries that have become experts in hacking, in affecting democracies of different countries. So the question is, how do we teach our children and our young people all of these technological skills, but at the same time be able to act ethically? And it's become a really, really important issue. And at the same time, we've got to nurture this culture of innovation, nurture the culture of solving our own problems. And very often, if you look at those countries that are innovative, they have a culture of empowerment, they have a culture of problem solving, they have diversity. And very often, immigrants play a particularly important role in innovation. So, you know, this whole thing about, for instance, xenophobia, we've seen just what's happened even in this country, where you have people who come to this country with nothing, from Somalia, from the DRC, from Nigeria, and so on. And they come here, they innovate, because they've got to make a plan, they've got to solve problems. And yet we have our own people who are sitting in the townships, in our villages, and so on, and they're waiting for someone to give them a job. So there's a lot that we have to do as a country to change our mindset of how we think about innovation. I will encourage our people to think differently and stop saying and promising people that we're going to do, or government is going to do stuff for them. Because we continue to cause huge amount of damage to the mindsets of our people. So you look at R&D itself, you know, I've already spoken about this. We've seen a reduction in R&D, especially, you know, George talked about the decline in the economy, especially what we've experienced since the global economic crisis in 2008. We've seen an absolute significant reduction in the private sector investment in R&D in the country. On the positive side, we've seen universities increase their spend in R&D, as well as state-owned enterprises, including organizations such as the CSIR. But obviously, if as a country our private sector is not investing even in R&D, it means that our percentage share of innovations in the world has declined. So you just need to look at the number of trademarks that we've registered as a country, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. Our percentage of trademarks or IP that's been registered in South Africa has declined quite significantly. So we've got to do something about this if we're going to grow innovation, especially innovation that's going to drive our industrial base. So to conclude, this is an issue not just for government. It's a problem not just for government. We need all the key stakeholders. We need the state-owned organizations, we need the private sector, we need higher education institutions to work together so that we're creating a common vision for our country to drive our innovation and drive our competitiveness in the global stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nxasana. So before we continue with the program, before I introduce Dr. Philip Goyns, who will give closing remarks, there's quite a lot of activity on Twitter, which makes me very happy, because it's the only way that we can expand the conversations, even for those who are not able to be here today, or people who are just following the conversation anywhere in the world. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to just share with you, actually, 2 or 3 tweets that particularly stood out for me. Stembile Bengu, where are you? Ah, there you are. Stembile Bengu says, effective collaboration between CSIR, education policymakers, and industry can contribute in shaping the jobs of the future. Absolutely. And Sabela Alfred, are you here? All right. Sabela could be anyway because we are also live streaming at the same time. But he says, it seems like Dr. Sizwe has been reading my mind. All the points he raises and solutions are what I've been thinking about. Well, there you go. There you go. Like I said, we are a community of problem solvers indeed. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, our next guest aboard of the CSIR, Dr. Philip Goyns, is a senior climate change advisor at the Prometheum Carbon and Energy and Environment Consultancy. Before this, he worked as a modeling specialist at the Department of Energy, where he was responsible for the development of the energy system optimization model used for the integrated energy plan. And prior to joining the Department of Energy, he was the program manager for Enerkey, a German-South African research partnership aimed at integrated energy planning and implementation in the Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, and Tshwane megacity region. Kindly help me give a very warm round of applause for Dr. Philip Goyns.
The aim of the 6th CSIR conference is to provide an interactive platform for stakeholders to share their experiences and insights as to on broader issues related to science and application to industrial development. It provides an opportunity for us to see how to collaborate on furthering our economic development. This conference is a key platform in a suite of many other activities the CSR is embarking on. We would like to acknowledge and express our appreciation to Minister Rob Davies, Minister of Trade and Industry, for sharing perspectives on government's facilitation on transformation of the economy to promote industrial development, investment, competitiveness, and the creation of employment. The Minister of Science and Technology, Naledi Pandor, in her absence, for her oversight, clear direction, and continued support for the CSIR. Dr. Thulani Dlamini, Chief CEO of the CSIR, for providing context and the theme for today's conference, and the warm welcome that he provided. Mr. Saul Levin, Executive Director, Trade and Industry Policy Strategies, on his insightful talk on the link between industrial policy and innovation. It is encouraging to see the IDC participating in this conference and that the partnership with the CSIR is bearing fruit. Thank you, Mr. Jorge Maia, for your talk on trends in the outlook for the global and South African economies. As the CEO mentioned in his address, we need to anchor our development through education, with particular emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These form the foundation of our industrial innovation and economic development. We need strong leadership in the sector. Thank you, Mr. Nxasana, for sharing on skills and innovation as a driver for industrial development in South Africa. Thank you to fellow board members and the CSR executive management. Our directive to capitalize the I in CSR is clear. CEOs, science councils in attendance, and public and private companies who are here today. This conference will not be a success without the speakers, national and international, who have committed their time to come and share their insights with us, our stakeholders and partners in various sectors. Your attendance and participation is invaluable to us. Thank you. Thank you for the entertainment provided by Soweto Opera Quadro. Program Director, for sterling job in running the proceedings this morning. On behalf of the CSIR board, I would like to encourage you to enjoy these 2 days with us, interact and network with the scientists, and visit the exhibition areas to witness some of our technologies. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor, and thank you to every single one of you who are here today. I certainly hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference, and remember to follow at CSIR on Twitter, as well as CSIR South Africa on Facebook and on Instagram, hashtag CSIRConf2017. Enjoy the rest of your day, and let's keep being a solutions-driven society. Thank you. Oh, I did notice when the doctor said a job well done to the program's director, some of you wanted to clap your hands. So you can give me a warm round of applause.